I'll reconvene Committee of the Whole. Executive session is now concluded. We'll report out in the evening meeting. And we have 3 additional items for Committee of the Whole this afternoon. The first being a resolution of the City of Bellingham, Washington, supporting the establishment of railroad quiet zones within city limits. Mayor Kelly has asked staff to prepare a formal request to the Federal Railway Administration to establish a quiet zone within the city limits. The establishment of a quiet zone requires improvements to at-grade crossings and will allow trains to decrease the use of their horn while traveling through the city. The city completed a quiet zone study in 2007, which identified 2 separate quiet zones in Bellingham, the Fairhaven Quiet Zone and the Waterfront Quiet Zone. I'll turn it over to Ted Carlson of Public Works.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Ted Carlson. Before the council this afternoon is a resolution supporting the implementation of quiet zones. We've talked about this a bit in the past. It's an issue that has been around. As Council President Lehman said, we did a study in 2007. We updated that study in 2012. We've had discussions with the Transportation Commission, who has supported moving forward with implementation of a quiet zone. We have been working with the railway, with BNSF, on 2 crossings in particular that were safety issues, and those are nearing completion, and those are C Street, which is temporarily closed. It was an uncontrolled at-grade crossing, and so we are under contract with BNSF. They'll go in and install quiet zone type crossings there, which are quad gates that do meet the standard set out in the quiet zone regulations. And the other crossing is the pedestrian crossing at the north end of Boulevard Park, which will also be improved to quiet zone standards. So those really were the priority because they were safety projects, and we have had issues at those intersections in the past. But now that those intersections are under contract, we would like the council to support the resolution to move forward with the formal process of working with not only BNSF but the Federal Rail Administration, FRA. We also would be working with the Washington Utility and Transportation Commission, which has some jurisdiction over private and pedestrian crossings, as well as working with WashDOT Rail. So there's a series of folks that we would work with, but primarily Federal Railway Administration has the authority here, and the process requires a formal request to start the process. So with the council's approval and support of this resolution, then the mayor would go ahead and move forward with that process, which is administrative in nature, and start by sending the letter to the railway, to the FRA, to get the process started. So certainly available to answer any questions about the process or about where we go moving forward from here.
Okay. Jean and then Michael.
I fully understand why we're moving this direction, but I have to ask, the estimated $5 to $6 million that it would cost, direct it to the mayor.
Yeah, thank you. There's 2 things. One, I think that making sure that we understand this isn't something that would be done right away, and it would definitely be based on availability of funds, which would come in as we look at all of the funds. The good news is that the state has recognized that this is a problem statewide. It's not just a problem in Bellingham. And the governor, when I spoke with him about this, is very aware that it would need to take more than local money to do these things. So I have had several questions since the article was in the newspaper about is the city going to put all their money into quiet zones? And the truth is, no, we're going to balance our priorities. But having said that, it's very good to have a strategy in place so you can take advantage of money that comes forward, that we have a plan, that we already have the agreements with the railroad, that we're going to do this, that we know what each other's responsible for, those type of things, and that we have a better idea, as Ted said, about how much it costs. So this isn't anything that commits us to everything right now, but it does demonstrate that our community is serious about wanting to deal with one of the issues with the increased train traffic that we're going to have through town, whether or not we have construction at Cherry Point. There will be more trains.
Okay, Michael?
Thank you. I've been looking at quiet zone issues for a while, and I'm fully in support of Section 1. I do think it is in our public's best interest. And that because quiet zones aren't just quiet, they're safer crossings. This is really about creating safer crossings through controlling the access with barriers and gates and things like that. But I do have a question about Section 2, which authorizes the mayor to take all actions necessary, and it goes back to the financial aspect. Can we narrow that and say take all administrative actions necessary, because I don't want any commitments for expenditures being implied when it says all actions necessary.
Okay,
Is
can
there
I
any-
just make it very clear that the mayor cannot take financial action without but without the council saying that we
Right,
need
and
to.
if we do this, it may look like we have given the approval. And I just want to remove that possibility by making, say, administrative actions.
Oh, you want to make a motion?
Well, sure, and I want to hear from legal about that. Move to
Maybe
amend
you should
Section
hear
2
about
to read, the
Ted.
mayor is authorized to take all, and insert the word administrative actions necessary to establish railroad quiet zones.
Matt Stamps, Legal Department.
1 second, Matt. We've got a second from Terry Borneman. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, sorry about that. There is that final phrase in Section 2 with any, it's all subject to applicable law, which would include the city's own requirements, legal requirements for budget and authorizing expense.
I think this basically would give the administration, whoever that administration might be, the ability to come forward with, do work and come forward with recommendations to the council that may be beyond signing a letter or having a phone call or whatever. And it's just recommendations. It's nothing else. And I think that Matt's point about our code includes the council's restrictions on what the mayor can do unilaterally is a very smart thing, and it exists whether it's quiet zones or something else, and I would hate to see us start micromanaging what the code says on any little thing, because I think the administration does have a lot of authority, but they can't make decisions without the agreement of the council.
Any further thoughts from council members? Terry?
Yeah, I can support the establishment of it, and I understand, we've been looking at this for quite a while, but I also, especially establishing it so that we can pursue grants and other kinds of funding options. But I do feel as we go forward, we have to prioritize, keep in mind the difference between a horn noise and somebody sleeping on the street, or how we spend other money, how balancing the importance of this against some other issues. And, many other issues do rise to a greater level. Yes, I hear the horns at night, and sometimes they wake me up. But that compared to sometimes our other spending problems and issues that this city's facing, we do have to keep it all in perspective when we're looking forward towards, how quickly we move and the money that we're putting forward.
And I absolutely
Yeah.
agree with you, Councilman Borneman, that this does not put quiet zones ahead of everything. It just makes the process that we're going through more standardized, so when we have the opportunity to invest, we've already know what we're investing in, and we're not just grabbing it, this quiet zone or that quiet zone, or this investment or that investment. So I agree with you, Terry.
Would anyone else like to speak to the motion?
Yes.
Jean?
Michael, would it make any difference to you if it said the mayor and council are authorized to take all actions necessary? Because everything that they come up with, any expenditures are going to have to come back up here for us to approve. I mean, we're kind of splitting hairs here, but I understand how it works. No money is spent unless we authorize it, so I'm not too concerned about what it says, but if it would make everybody feel better, the mayor and council are authorized to take all actions necessary. I don't know.
Well, I
Just
don't
a
think
thought.
we need to authorize ourselves. That's
Oh,
kind of funny.
yeah.
I just think that the mayor will be taking administrative acts, but the way this is so broadly written, it appears to be giving approval for more than just administrative acts. I'm hearing that it will be interpreted as administrative acts, and so why not clarify it and remove any possibility of misinterpretation?
Well, I also think, though, that we will be making recommendations that aren't administrative for you to approve of.
Yeah.
So I think that you're trying to limit a power that doesn't really exist because it doesn't look good, and I don't know if that's worth our time to do that, as long as you understand that this is all in a partnership anyway. So at a minimum, it potentially could be what Jean was saying, but I wouldn't want to, if you read the charter, I don't know if you'd want to just say administrative acts that I have, because it's pretty broad. So unless we want to start rewriting the charter, and we could do that, but that's up to the people.
Okay. Pinky would like to speak.
I actually like the way it's worded. I think it sounds pretty powerful. I realize that we're not saying we're going to move our budget from what we're doing now over into this, but it feels like it's making it shovel-ready project, so that if the grant money or things come around and the state starts looking at doing this, we're ready to go. And that's the way I'm looking at it. And I like the wording because it sounds powerful and it sounds like we're all in. We're not saying we're giving away our money yet, but we are supporting it. So I'm good with this wording. But I do respect what you're saying, Michael. I like to think that we're in.
Okay. Regarding the motion, I'm going to vote against it. It's redundant, and if someone doesn't understand the basic function of council and the mayor, then they should read city laws. And so, anyone else want to speak to this? Okay. Considering the motion to add the word administrative in front of the mayor's authority for Section 2, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed?
No.
Okay, motion fails 5-2 with Lilliquist and Weiss in favor. And now moving on to the larger motion.
I'll move the resolution.
Second.
Okay, anyone want to speak to the resolution? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes 7-0. Next up. Consideration of 2 petitions for annexation of properties in the city's northern UGA. Proposal 1, Mount Baker Highway annexation of 188.6 acres, and Proposal 2, East Bakerview Road and Mount Baker Highway annexation of 163.5 acres. Per RCW 35.13.125, a meeting must be held by the City Council to determine whether or not to initiate the review process for the proposed annexations. The Council must determine 3 things: whether the City will accept, reject, or geographically modify the proposed annexation. The second item, whether the City will require simultaneous adoption of zoning regulations. And the third item, whether the City will require the assumption of all or any portion of the City's indebtedness. If Council chooses to initiate the review of one or both annexation requests, approval of the resolution in the packet starts the review process. Prior to a final decision on the annexation, the Council will hold a public hearing. And I think Moshe Quinn from Planning is here to walk us through it, and also Greg.
I apologize. I accidentally hit the button and it turned off into this, and I had it up,
That's
so I'm trying to
okay.
figure it out.
Happens
so I
to
don't
the
know
best
if
of
Linda
us.
could help me out here.
You'd be surprised how often we do that around here.
Oh, there it is. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Moshe Quinn. I'm with the Planning and Community Development Department, and today I'll be giving a presentation on 2 annexations that the city has received.
Get the mic closer to you.
I'm a little bit taller. Thank you. So the city has received 2 annexations petitions for annexation of properties to the city of Bellingham. Per RCW, the city is required to hold a meeting within 60 days of the date of application, and so we are meeting that requirement. The city council is required to determine whether to accept, reject, or modify the proposed annexation, require simultaneous adoption of zoning regulations, and determine whether to require the assumption of all or any portion of the city's indebtedness. The 2 petitions for annexations are located in the city's northern urban growth area. Basically, this area is known as the Dewey Valley Planning Area, and you have the Mount Baker Highway that runs this eastern line coming down this way, and then it traverses all the way over to the city limits to the west. The Dewey Valley Planning Area, according to our annexation phasing plan, is known as an immediate area, and that's because the level of urban development that's in that area, as well as the amount of existing developments that are already on city services. This area also provides a great benefit for population as well as future employment growth. So today I'm going to be going over Proposal 1 and 2. We had to basically kind of separate them out because they generally cover a majority of the same area. The first petition that we received is for approximately 186 acres, and it extends all the way out to, I think that's Ross Road there. The total assessed valuation is just over $25 million. The second proposal is for just over 163 acres, and has an assessed value of just over $24 million. So both areas, as they encompass generally the same area, they have two Whatcom County zoning designations. Each proposal contains 25 acres of industrial land, and the remaining portion is zoned urban residential mixed use, or URMX, and the density there is 6 units per acre with the possibility of achieving 12 through TDRs. URMX also has a mixed use allowance to allow a certain percentage of multifamily development. It's basically 25% of the allowed units per site area. So that's something that's a provision in the county code. As part of Proposal 2, the petitioner has requested, generally when we look at zoning for annexed areas, we do comparable zoning. In 2012, the city did an interlocal agreement with the county where council can look at alternative zones through that process, and this petitioner would like their property, which is approximately just over 2 acres, which is these vacant parcels here and here. He would like to do, he would like a commercial designation. Currently, they have an administrative approval for a mixed-use development in the county that was approved in 1998, which consisted of commercial and residential uses there. So if either proposal is initiated, we would also look at this alternative zone for this area as part of the annexation review process. And we will do further analysis on that too. So existing and future conditions. In Proposal 1, there's currently 86 dwelling units with an estimated population of 245. This area has the potential capacity of 262 to 537 new dwelling units and a population of just about 1,300. With the additional population, for level of service for parks, you're looking at about 23 to 47 acres of parks, trails, and open space. Proposal 2 is generally the same in regards to existing dwelling units. The new dwelling units at 187 to 387 is different from the other proposal by a significant, not a significant margin, but a little bit larger margin. That's because some of the northern properties have a little bit more development potential because they have less environmental constraints on them. So it's projected that this area can handle approximately 460 to 950 people. And based on that number, 14.5 to 34 acres of parks, trails, and open space. Currently, there's 80 existing jobs in the area, and 66% of those jobs are with Whatcom Counseling Services that's established in the URMX area. Each annexation proposal has 25 acres of industrial land, and based on our methodology to calculate how much square footage and potential for new employment, we're predicting 75,000 to 150 square feet of new industrial development, as well as that area providing 100 to 300 new jobs. One important point that I would like to make out is with both proposals, 82 to 83% of the properties are currently served by city water, sewer, or both. 82 to 83% of the properties. So we also did a draft financial forecast. A forecast it's basically for forecasting potential impacts on the city. It's a forecast, it's not a budget. So, there's some general similarities in both of them. The police department has identified that they would need 2 new officers to serve this area, and that also projects from other areas that have been annexed in the northern urban growth area. The potential for 1 new firefighter, but that'll also depend on the negotiations that the city does between Fire District 4 and I think it's North Whatcom Fire and Rescue. So that's what's anticipated. The next number is $2.7 million of parks capital costs. That's the amount of parklands the city would need to serve the additional population of the area. And I would like to just note that this figure was just based on Proposal 1. So for Proposal 2, it could go up or down based on the level of development. Currently, new development capacity has not been achieved yet, but it's anticipated to be $100,000 worth of improvements to the sewer lift station. And so I don't know that number as of yet, but it just will depend on how that area develops. All streets and utility projects paid for by others. The 5-year deficit is just close to $400,000, 10-year deficit, $1.2 million, and the 20-year deficit at $2.8 million. So I've listed here 4 options for City Council's consideration. The first consideration is to initiate the review process for Proposal 1 and accepting the boundaries that are proposed, or you can accept the annexation petition for Proposal 2 without modification of those boundaries, or the third option is combine Proposal 1 and 2 as well as add the whole entire Dewey Valley planning area of 302 acres to the proposal, just to look at it as we did back in 2009. And the fourth option is do not accept either annexation petition. So when staff's evaluating annexation proposal, we're looking for logical boundaries and areas that we can square off and provide good, adequate service areas for city services. Staff believes that Proposal 2 provides that. It's an area that we can just square off by going in and taking in a larger chunk and not create a peninsula of an incorporated area that may be more difficult to serve. And so with that, staff, again, recommends Proposal 2 without modification of the boundary, require the simultaneous adoption of zoning regulations, and assumption of all or any portion of city indebtedness. And with that, I can answer any of your questions, and we also have additional staff here that can also answer your questions.
Thank you, Moshe. Jack and then Jean.
Moshe, just going off of what you were just talking about as far as the peninsula on Proposal 1, with the Boundary Review Board, since the Growth Management Act had put the language in there about logical boundaries, has our Whatcom County Boundary Review Board ever denied an annexation proposal or modified boundaries because of irregular boundaries, not logical ones, that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of where they have. I know according to my research, there's been talk of what they call corridor annexations, where they're just connected by right-of-way, whether that's appropriate boundaries or not for service, or they call them shoestring or hourglass, and there has been some case law in regards to those not being supported as logical boundaries.
But nothing associated with peninsulas?
Nothing that I am aware of with the BRB not allowing it.
Yeah, Alan, I have a question for you to start out with. Moshe, could you put the options back up there again, if you can
Yes.
get them back up there? Where it says option 3, option 3 where it says you combine 1 and 2 and the whole entire Dewey Valley, that puts us right back where we were 6 years ago. So can the council come up with their own options?
Council can choose to expand the boundaries.
Or
And I
what
think
what
that
I'm-
proposal 3 attend.
What
is-
okay,
go ahead,
what I'm
sorry.
getting at, both Mr. Wilson and Mr. Quam have been steered in the direction that they're in now by bringing these both forward. And if we combine those two and then the whole entire Dewey Valley, in my opinion, we get back to square one. So can the council just, without including the whole Dewey Valley area, can we initiate 1 and 2? We can. Is that right?
Well, I think 1 includes all of 2.
Correct.
Okay.
It's the difference between the two is, and let me put the map back up here.
Yeah, I might be missing something here, so go ahead and...
So the difference in here is you have, I think there's 1, 2, 3 properties here, and then 2 properties here. And so this right here equates to about 25 acres of URMX land. And so this area here is the lower portion of this area here. And so both petitioners had neighborhood meeting, and at one time they were thinking about going together, but after the neighborhood meeting, one thought they had a better chance going in their own direction than the other direction. So they kind of pulled away and did another neighborhood meeting showing the revised boundaries that they were looking at. And they were looking forward for the best proposal to go forward. Each of them are going forward with their own merits, of course, that they believe in.
What I'm saying is that if they go together, we have to either yay or nay both of them, or we can separate them apart, right?
Well, if you initiate Proposal 1, that encompasses all of Proposal 2.
That's
But I'm sorry, Alan, once you initiate it, then you can't change the boundaries. So if you want, whatever boundaries you think are appropriate need to be set now,
okay.
okay?
Yeah, I
Can't change
yeah.
them.
But
Go ahead, Jack.
if we had, I guess if we initiated both of them, then that decision as to what's most appropriate can be put off to later on and find out whether or not the signature gathering is successful for either or both of them. And then we can also decide what the overall, we get more information about what the overall impacts are to the city. But that's another option, right? It's just simply initiating both of them as they are presented, even though Proposal 1 includes Proposal 2.
Yes, you could do that. And Moshe and Greg, correct me if you could also get to the public hearing where you're making your final decision, and I believe you would have the ability to scale back the boundaries at that time. So if you just initiated Proposal 1, you could always scale it back to Proposal 2 before making a final decision.
Okay, I didn't know
But
that.
Jack, you're saying if we allowed both to go forward, there'd be 2 paths for signature gathering.
Yeah.
Terry?
Under Jack's idea of allowing both to go, how does that work out in terms of filing fees, costs, other kinds of things?
I'm not sure, but it seems redundant in that if you did both, you'd have 2 different petitions out there. You'd have 2 different analyses, by staff on each one. I don't know about the cost. Maybe planning would know something about that.
I think it's just, they've already both paid the initial cost. I think it's just over $500 to go through the whole process if initiated. But I would like to make one point from what I've heard about at least getting signed petitions for this area, because the next step would be the 60% petition method. And what I heard was some individuals were having problems getting property owners to sign the petition because they already signed the other petition, and they didn't want to sign the other proponent's petition. And so that became something that was a little bit more difficult. So that's just one thing I want to make clear, that you start getting these little, I would say, conflicts between petitioners.
I've got one quick question, Jack. Moshe, can you explain again for option 3, combining 1 and 2, why then would we modify to include the entire UGA? What does that part mean?
I think what it is you'd basically just take in the whole Dewey Valley planning area. As you may recall, back in 2009, there was a lot of opposition for that proposal.
Right.
And staff believed, if we're going to fight a battle for one of these, we might as well just do it for the whole area at one time. Just do it once instead of having another proposal come in for, say, another area to the north and fight the same battle again. So it was just kind of putting everything in one basket.
Okay, thank you. Jack, and then Jean?
Yes.
Okay,
I don't
Jean.
think we have enough headgear to go through that again, to be honest with you. No football helmet's going to be strong enough for that one. So I think I'm torn between letting them both go and see what happens. We'll bring them both forward, and I don't know. I feel for both these people who've tried for a long time to get this carved out. It was a royal battle back then, and the other people don't have any notion of wanting to be in this. So I don't know. I don't want to go that route.
Terry?
Just clarification again. If we went with option 1, you're saying at some point down it can be scaled back if it looks like that was...
Some of the research I did, because it's a legislative process, during the public hearing process, council can't add on to the area, but they can reduce the size of the area.
Before it gets to the public hearing, though, you have to have the 60% signature first. Is that correct?
That would be the very next step in the annexation process.
Okay, so, yeah. So if we went with option 1 and they don't get the 60%, then it's done.
But also to go back with what Jack was saying is that if a proposal went to the BRB and they found that the boundaries weren't logical, then it ends right there if they deny it as well.
Okay.
Greg or Kelly?
That's what I was going to, just going to remind you that if you go with proposal 1 with a somewhat irregular boundary and the boundary review board rejects that, then it's dead at that point.
Okay. Kelly, did you want to add anything?
Well, I think I was going to say what Terry said, so I don't need to say that.
Michael?
I'd like to talk about the financial analysis on page 169. It shows an annual deficit, which adds for the general fund in particular, which adds up to, in the millions over a decade or two. But I also thought I read in the staff memo that those financial projections were based on some general purpose assumptions that maybe are more accurate when applied to larger areas where peculiarities even out. Is that true? And how much should I trust these numbers? Because this is a deficit, and I don't like that idea. And also, is this for proposal 1 or proposal 2?
This is for proposal 1. Unfortunately, we didn't have very much time with the council dates from when these applications were made in beginning of November, which made 60 days up in January, which we didn't have council dates set, so we had to basically do this within 30 days. So unfortunately, we only had time to do it for proposal 1, but because it encompassed both areas, we wanted to give that information. It's my understanding that the numbers that our GIS department gives for this proposal is what Brian Henshaw uses to prepare this financial analysis, and it's based on those assumptions of the potential development and the new population of the area, and going into more of what the revenue can be gained in that area. And maybe if Brian wants to add anything to this, he can come up here and...
Well, one of the things
Like a
that
no.
if Greg could maybe clarify, that he just clarified with me, something about the deficit, so.
Okay.
I would just say that because we did the review for proposal number 1, if you initiate 2, the numbers will change. The deficit will be less because it's a smaller area and includes less residential zone land. So the numbers would be better from our perspective than what's shown here. The other thing is that these are very preliminary numbers. And if you initiate the review process, then that gives us more time to actually go back and take a real strong look at these and come up with numbers that are probably will help you more make a decision in the end than these are. This is a preliminary look at the area.
I guess that's what I wanted to know. These are preliminary numbers, as you put it, maybe based on kind of boilerplate assumptions. And if we initiate, say, proposal 1 or 2, you'll come back with a more accurate financial picture, and that will be part of our decision?
Yes.
Will it be ready for the hearing, or just come after the hearing?
No, it would be ready for the hearing.
Okay. And maybe our police chief Cook might want to respond to this part. We're adjusting our beats, our patrol beats, to improve how they're each individually drawn to make better use of our manpower. Area 1 is kind of nice and neatly, or proposal 2 is nice and neatly contained. 2 police officers seems like a lot. Is there a possibility that with the adjustment of patrol beats, it may only be 1 police officer? Because that would be a significant savings, because adding a police officer is the single largest drain on the general fund in this analysis.
Well, let me just say, though, I think that what Greg had mentioned to me is that it wasn't the service costs of fire and police, it was the parks costs that were driving the numbers up.
I don't, well, I'm going to ask a part question later, but I didn't see that under the general fund operating.
Chief, did you want to say anything?
You're not on.
Not on. Thank you.
Yeah.
There are a couple of issues here. The first issue is that this annexation alone is not requiring the 2 officers. This annexation, aggregated with all the prior annexations in the last 2 years, have now got us to the point where we need to add the officers if the annexation goes forward, because it's combined impact on staffing. Yes, we have redesigned beats. The beat configuration will go into place after the first of the year. However, even with the beat reconfiguration, we're not fully staffed in patrol where we can cover every beat. Historically, the north end of the city is causing the largest drain on our staffing on any given shift, but particularly on the swings and graveyard shift. In many cases, we're having to pull an officer from the southern end of the city to help cover the calls for service in the northern end of the city, which creates an imbalance. Has impacts on us both in response times to the southern end of the city, and it draws police resources out of an area of the city that's well established and should be receiving full services. The other issue is that our current scheduling, which the staffing and deployment study determined was our best balanced way of scheduling our personnel because of our training needs and other issues. The reality is 2 officers represent 1, because in order to cover 1 shift, and these 2 officers would not cover more than a 10-hour, 40-minute shift on any given day, but the shifts are split. So while one group of officers is off, the other group is working. So the reality is 1 position is actually 2 people. So in sum, we have reached this point where if the annexation goes forward, our department's belief is that we need to add those 2 personnel, which really is 1 officer on a shift, probably midday, starting about 10:30 in the morning and running until the end of that shift 10 hours later.
Follow-up.
Okay, go ahead, Michael.
On the police issue, what you just said, Chief Cook, seemed to imply that it may not be accurate to assign all of this new cost to this 1 annexation, maybe a quarter of it or some fraction. Would that be reflected in a better analysis? Because right now it looks like a money loser, but it may not be a money loser when analyzed correctly. And I want to make sure that that's a reasonable guess.
I don't do the financial computations for the city, but I think that would be a good way to put it.
Thank you.
Gene.
Let me ask another question again, see if I can, if we have a public hearing on both proposal 1, proposal 2, and they get all the signatures, bring it forward, you're saying that if proposal 1 goes to the boundary review board and they think that little corner there is a stretch, then they can shoot down the whole thing? Is that what you said, Greg? They can do that. So on that night, if we were to send these both forward, even though options 1's both of them, I feel for both people. I mean, they've been through this for a long time. The last thing I want to do is throw any one of them under the bus. But I mean, that makes sense to me. But I'm not on the boundary review board, so this is a tough one. I'd like to see them both get their day in court and have their hearing and go forward. But then again, I don't know. That's
Terry?
I do think one of the dangers of trying to send 2 forward, meaning each of them has to have 60% individual signatures, is that one you know, I've signed one, I'm not signing another kind of stuff, it ends up hurting those having to go out and do the signatures. And
If we
so
were...
if you want both, you should probably make a
I
motion
know.
just to send one through.
Okay.
Or,
I will, but the last question, if we send proposal 2 and everything goes well and that all goes forward, at a later date, can Mr. Wilson come back again with something else?
Sure. As long as the property remains in the city's urban growth area, it's always eligible for annexation.
Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and make a proposal that we send proposal 2 forward. It's an unfortunate thing, but I understand how this whole thing's been lumped together and all the controversy over it, so I'll go ahead and make the motion we send proposal 2 forward.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. We had Pinky, Jack, and Michael that wanted to speak. And then after that, let's try and get to a vote.
Okay. I just had a question about Proposal 1, because if I understand this correctly, it's carved out because all of the residents who live in there want to participate. So we already have their support. So it's very likely that they could get 60%, over 60%, because they're asking for those individuals. What I'm worried about is whether the Boundary Review Board comes back and says, okay, well, if we don't agree on that corner, then we we don't do the whole thing. Can we ask that of the board? Or so that, because this Proposal 1, Proposal 2, I think is very confusing for constituents on what to sign, what not to sign, but could we not put the Proposal 1 forward, but asking the review board if they consider those small parcels in the corner not eligible, that they still consider Proposal 2? Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
I think what it is
That makes sense.
today we have to decide on which boundaries to move forward, and then it can't grow beyond that. It can only be reduced in size through the legislative process. So this is where we set the boundaries, I guess, as far as you want to go out within this area.
Jack and then Michael?
So much of the assessed valuation is actually in the Trickle Creek development, and they have a no contest for signing these petitions. So the valuation issue seems like, I mean, the 60% issue seems like it's going to kind of take care of itself through the no contest provision. Am I correct in that?
Yeah. A large portion is served by that area, but you have a lot of property owners along Mount Baker Highway too that add to it. And I think, talking with some of the petitioners is they wanted to show council how many people wanted to be annexed with this proposal rather than not. So they were trying to get more than 60%.
Of course.
On that, just to show that. Yes, the whole Trickle Creek area is on a non-protest.
Okay. And then...
but I don't know if that would equate to one being 60 and one not being 60 with the other properties added into that.
For Proposal 1, with the extension, the staff report mentions that the police department is concerned about servicing Ross Road and some other areas in there because of the positioning of homes and the streets and what side of the street would actually get city service versus county service. Is that big of an issue? I mean, is that a real concern? I mean, I read it in the report, so I'm just wanting to verify how substantial the concern is.
It is a concern. If it's not the entire roadway, then their confusion results is in respects to who's going to respond. And it's sometimes, even though there's that confusion, both departments, the county sheriff and our department, will respond. And I think that's a resource drain that we've got to be careful about not creating. So for me, the question is the entire roadway our responsibility, and therefore all accidents that occur on that roadway or other hazards that occur on that roadway, and then that's a drain on resources. But if we're going to make a commitment, that would be my preference. But, obviously we don't, or I don't control what is actually going to come into the annexation. And I know there are other issues in regards to Public Works, whether they want that responsibility because of other issues around utilities.
Okay. And then one other question I had associated with the multifamily explanation that's in the staff report. I really didn't understand how the multifamily in the toolkit would be used with this underlying county zoning and what we would then convert into city zoning. Is this whole area going to be open for toolkit purposes, even though it gets zoned single family?
There is a provision in our current infill toolkit that talks about areas that are annexed after, I think it's 1996 or 98, that if they contain a mixed-use qualifier, they have the opportunity to do the toolkit because of that multifamily component that already exists in the county zoning for that. So that would be more than likely an opportunity, and of course we'd provide more analysis on that depending on which proposal goes forward on that type of zoning.
So all of the URMX would then qualify for that then?
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Michael?
I have a process question about the Boundary Review Board. Does that occur before or after the hearing? When does that occur in the sequence? Because if we're going to have a hearing, and if we schedule, well, yeah, when does that occur relative to the hearing and the petition?
If council initiates one of these proposals, then the petitioners go out and get 60%. Once they get the 60%, then it goes to the Boundary Review Board. They do their review, and if they approve, then it comes to council for a final decision.
So they could reject it before we even get a chance to look at it. Okay. I really am favorably disposed towards looking at Proposal 2 in particular because the commercial component of the light impact industrial, I think, is important to keep that balance. It's it's the edge of the Iron Gate district, and that little crossroads commercial area that they have that kind of administrative approval. I'm leery of proposal number 1. I think the Wilson property is fine for development. It's just located in the wrong place. It's just stuck out on a finger, and I really do think that looks exactly like what the Boundary Review Board would be watching against. If I understand the rules correctly, I think we'd be at risk with some kind of reversal and taking away our option. I think what I hear in a lot of discussion is there some way we can kind of keep both alive long enough and make the right decision at the right time? And I'm not seeing a good way, unless I'm misunderstanding, about whether or not we can expand the boundaries later or not expand the boundaries later. So I'm thinking the proposal 1 is maybe doomed by process. I'm thinking, if I understand properly.
Okay, we have a motion and a second for Proposal 2. Is there anyone else who would like to speak to it? Jack?
I think it's just a question, a long-term question associated with the Dewey Valley itself and the areas directly to the east of Mr. Wilson's property. When we go through our comp plan update and we're having to re-examine our UGA areas, the fact that we had received such vehement opposition in the last Dewey Valley annexation, is that going to influence our decisions about what we do for long-term boundaries? And what is going to be the situation for the areas east as far as Tweed 20 and Hillsdale and the areas up by Gundy's?
Yes, as part of the comp plan update, we'll be looking at all of the areas in our UGA to see if they are appropriate to be included in the UGA, including that northern part of the Dewey Valley area. One of the factors that you consider when you talk about setting UGA boundaries is the presence of urban levels of development. And certainly Tweed 20, Hillsdale, those areas are characterized by urban development. Even though they haven't annexed, they probably should be in our UGA. So yes, we would be looking at that portion of the Dewey Valley UGA where we know from past experience people are not interested in annexation. And if that area, it's obviously a county decision, but if we decide to recommend to take out some area, we would need to look at where we might replace that capacity someplace else.
Gary?
Yeah, part of me, when I look at it, just doing proposal 2 makes a lot of sense because of the lines fit well with the current city boundaries for efficiency of service and other things. But if we're looking at it in terms of what Jack just brought forward, the idea of the other part, if we do think this would be a good idea at some time for the Wilson property, the other pieces to be part of our urban, of the city, this is a much better chance of it going through. If it doesn't go through on this one, and then you try to get 60% vote with what remains of the urban growth zone there, good luck. You probably won't be able to get that 60%, at least the way it was, when it was brought forward last time. So that's the other consideration of it. If we think this does belong and along, Mount Baker Highway is a good choice, then we might want to consider it now, even though it doesn't line up as well. It's just to muddy it a little more.
What is the motion at the moment, please?
Proposal 2.
Proposal 2 is on the floor with a motion by Jean and a second by Terry. Pinky.
I'm struggling because I walked in here thinking I was going to support Proposal 1. And I'm worried that we're at risk of losing the whole bag because we're not including those teeny little, the other small pieces that are probably very, very important to the people who live there. And I think we have to look towards our future, and we have to start annexing, and we need to grow a little. And I don't want to lose it if the boundary board believes that it is not a good parcel. So I just wanted to say that I'm struggling because I thought I was going to make one decision, and now I feel as though because of legislation and what's actually might be more beneficial for the majority is Proposal 2, and that's different than I thought.
I'm going to ask something real fast, Michael. Criteria for what constitutes a bad decision on our part, is that just that it looks like a peninsula? I mean, say, does what's around it impact their ruling, or the rate of travel on the road in front of it, or anything like that?
Are you talking about criteria that the Boundary Review Board uses?
Yes.
Or that the council uses?
Or is it just that it looks isolated on a map?
The Boundary Review Board will be looking at logical boundaries, so what makes sense in terms of how the area is served with water, sewer, police, fire, those kinds of facilities. Part of their review process includes an opportunity for the county and the fire districts to weigh in whether or not either one of these proposals would cause problems for them in terms of services or even financially. That's all part of the process as well. For council, the major factor is this in the best interest of the city to include this property inside the city limits is really the bottom line criteria that the council uses. But logical boundaries, that's one of the main charges of the Boundary Review Board. That's probably the major reason for their existence. And also to give voice to other jurisdictions that might be impacted, like a fire district.
Alan has some.
Alan?
Yeah, I would just say Proposal 1 presents more risk of a challenge before the Boundary Review Board than Proposal 2, in that the proposed boundary is what MRSC would call a shoestring boundary, where the connection to the Wilson property is just a right-of-way. Mm-hmm. And there is some case law that would say that's subject to challenge, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Proposal 1, that expansion on Proposal 2 before you get to the Wilson property may include some property owners that are opposed to the annexation. So you're creating risk for people who are opposed to the annexation to challenge it before the Boundary Review Board.
Okay.
That makes it even
That
clearer.
helps. Thank you, Alan.
Call for the question.
Okay. We have a motion and a second for Proposal 2. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes 7-0. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Last item of the afternoon. Okay. Okay, our third and final item, I'll give folks a second to clear out here, but we are going to move on. Third and final item this afternoon is our rental housing registration program work session. Consideration of an ordinance establishing a rental registration and inspection program will be happening in this work session. The draft ordinance has been revised consistent with Council's direction provided at the November 24th work session and also incorporates minor clarifications that will assist in future implementation. Staff is currently developing an implementation strategy for the proposed program. Fees associated with this program will be considered by Council prior to implementation. I think we have Peter and Rick, our new planning director, Rick Sepler, here with us this afternoon.
Yeah, Peter Rufato. I think I'll start off. As requested, you have in the packet a revised ordinance. I would like to highlight some of the changes. After that, Rick Sepler will go over some more detail regarding implementation, cost, and some administrative aspects. To provide a framework for the revisions, you'll see revisions that fall into two categories. One, revisions that Council has given direction on to change, either a specific language or a general policy direction, like we're going to inspect all properties over a period of time. In the track changes version of the ordinance, I tried to identify the impetus for the revision, whether that was a staff recommendation or council action, as well as the rationale for each revision. And I'll just go through the substantive changes, but one general comment on this ordinance: it outlines a fairly detailed program. However, there are sections that grant authority to the director to establish rules. And some of the revisions go a little bit further down that road to provide some flexibility, since we're at the, we're pre-program implementation, and to allow the planning department to really tailor some of those administrative aspects to what will work best. So with that, I'm just going to go through the changes in the track changes version. And if there's a question, please feel free to raise that. Starting on page 177 of the packet, there's a whereas clause added that really tries to identify or clarify this issue about existing structures and what they would have to comply with in terms of the building code, just to make it clear that there are no new standards being established through this ordinance, and it recognizes that existing structures do not have to update based on changes to the code. And moving right along to page 179, at the top, it identifies under the definition of a city building code enforcement officer that may refer, for inspection purposes, to someone that the city contracts with to do that work. That doesn't mean it has to be, but it allows flexibility to have that if that's the way the program goes. And under G, declaration of compliance, this is some language. It establishes that document that's to be submitted, if it's a self-certification, is to the best of the landlord's knowledge after an on-site review. And so it really adds language to make clear that it's really a reasonableness standard, and it's not to be overly onerous. On the same page, under N, this is a general, again, establishing authority for the director to establish a process for approval of what is a qualified rental housing inspector. So you'd have to meet one of several elements that are outlined, but also some process, and that was council's action on November 17th to have some sort of, I guess, certification or approval process so that you're on a list. The next one I'd like to highlight is on page 181. and it's under scope, A1. This is Councilmember Weiss's revision that makes it clear. I believe this was voted on by council. I can't recall, but it makes it clear that the registration will be required if there is a single-family unit, a single-family residence has an associated ADU or carriage house that is made available for rent. There's a typo there on the explanation. Keep in mind that the way this ordinance is laid out, there's the scope, there's certain things that fall completely outside the ordinance, and then later on we'll get to a section where you may be exempt from payment of the registration fee and subject to inspection. So there's two different ways of sort of being exempted, two levels of exemption. On that same page, under scope, under B, we added the words only, so that it's very clear that the only standards that will be used are those standards to determine whether the unit would endanger or impair the health or safety of a tenant. In terms of changes, I'm going to page 182. At the top, B, there's language added to say that an incentive can be developed by the director to provide an incentive for those rental properties that pass the initial inspection. And this is important because later on we did make there's a staff recommendation to not have a different potential for a different inspection cycle to 5 years, but this sort of recognizes that the director can establish an incentive program through the fee process. On the same page, under B, number 4, council took action on this such that if there is a detached ADU, it will be subject to the fee and be subject to inspection. The next big change is starting on that same page on 182E, there's a deletion of most of the specific elements for the application because the staff recommendation is that that's appropriate for the director to develop. Those are really administrative in nature. Gives flexibility to do what makes sense under whatever software program is used and what makes sense in terms of the information that will be most helpful. I'm looking now at page 184. We made a change under G, the display of the registration. There was a desire by staff to not make it have to be on the inside of the front door, just kind of a sense of what would be most flexible and what people may not want it on the inside of their front door, I guess, is the simple answer to that. And H, we took out the word list and made it basically information, and planning may be able to address that in more detail, but in the age of databases, I don't know if it's so much that there'll be a list, but there's going to be information available. Moving on to the next page, 185, under certificates of inspection. This is really the biggest action taken by council recently, and so we reintroduced the requirement that there will be annual inspections, and it establishes that once every 3 years. This does not again include the ability to go to a 5-year inspection cycle. Moving on to page 186. Under C, there's a provision added here that makes it very clear, just like it did in the whereas clause, that no provision is intended to impose building or fire code standards for existing structures beyond the standards for existing structures already set forth in the building code. Starting on 186 and continuing on under E, this is where we took out some of the specific elements of a certificate of inspection. We maintained certain elements, but took out some to leave that for the director to develop as an administrative matter. On 187 under F, I think Councilman Lillquist requested something along these lines, and I think it makes sense. If there is some other inspection that's been done out there, this allows but does not require the city to accept that inspection by some other agency in lieu of the city inspection. And the last, well, I guess not the last, but page 190. starting at the top, so you see A, B, and C up there. So this is all under really trying to tie together the ability to do complaint-based inspections and this program. A clarifies the process for a complaint-based inspection and ties it together with this chapter. And B and C kind of goes further and basically says if you have a certain history of problems under a complaint-based system, you would be added to the list for the next year for the regular inspection. This allows the inspection resources to be focused on properties that have a history of having been problematic.
And Peter, that's not just that if complaints been made, but only if findings were actually lodged, and if they were appealed, they were actually upheld. Right,
And I think it's important that one of the challenges with this is a regular inspection program is a legally authorized way to get around a warrant requirement. But if you're going to take a complaint and that before you turn that complaint into something that puts you on the list, you have to have that ability to challenge it. And so it's a due process concept. And then the last change that I'll highlight is just that we made the change to a review process on page 193 instead of having the council have to take action for this ordinance to remain in effect. And that's all I have.
Great, thank you, Peter. Very thorough, appreciate it. And nice glasses. Anyone Rick, would you like to add?
I was going to say, it might be useful if I talk about implementation, since there's a marriage between the provisions of the draft before you and the potential for implementing before we answer questions specifically, because we might answer some of those during the presentation. Thanks, members of the council. Council provided policy direction on this matter, and it's for staff to find out the most expedient, cost-effective way and fair way to implement it. The city attorney has provided you with the structure of the ordinance that implements your policy direction, and the charge towards planning community development was to find a fair way to implement it, acknowledging that a number of questions are yet to be answered, but make reasonable assumptions so you feel good confidence interval before you take any potential action on it. Towards that end, Peter did acknowledge a number of changes we proposed that allow specificity, such as the application itself, to be deferred. The backstory on that is, depending on the means we use to receive the information, it may be more cost-effective to be able to tailor it to the technology than spending a great deal of money to tailor the technology to get information we can get through other means, such as the assessor. So we were trying to balance the least amount of cost for the user as well as for the city on that. I should note that the ordinance contains a July 1st start date, and as you'll hear in a moment, we feel that we can facilitate registration by that date, provided that we actually start taking registration information by the 1st, not 60 days before that date. We can get the issues up. So a clarification we'd request would be to initiate the program, 30-day window for information to be filed electronically. We think we could facilitate that. By the end of July, we'd have a record of all of the applicable properties within our means. We're just not confident that we would be able to take information prior to that. In terms of incentives, as the city attorney mentioned, we did have a significant concern, and I'll share the basis for that. In contacting other jurisdictions that have similar programs, we found that 85 to 90% of those inspected pass on the first time. So essentially, the vast majority of the number of units that are there would pass. And the conflict is the duration of your inspections as opposed to the proposed incentive. And let me see if I can characterize it. You would see 1/3 of each of the units that are out there. Within 3 years, 100% of the units are inspected. However, the 4th year would only have 10% of the first year's units being inspected. And what that does is create a 2-year void in terms of having staffed up or contracted out or built a system. Every year for 3 years, you do 1/3 of the available units. At the end of 3 years, it's 100% coverage. Let's take that first year. It's 2,700 roughly inspections that are facilitated. All but 270 based on other jurisdictions pass in the first or second time. So they go on to an annualized basis. The number of inspections required for the fourth year is not 2,700, it's more like 400. And the fifth year is 400. Then the sixth year goes back up to about 3,000. So it creates an uneven assessment. And there are several ways through this. One might be to provide a financial incentive for those who provide compliance and clearly within the direction of council. Another is to extend the term from 3 years to a longer period to sort of even out the workload. This is one where those lesser inspections means that the carrying costs are higher for the staff, for the equipment, for the things you have to do to implement it. And those costs are borne by the folks who apply for registration. One would suggest that you probably would lower the cost by having a different kind of incentive provided. And I could talk more specifically about that. We did run an analysis on it to see what the numbers look like. Again, the key consumption is based on other jurisdictions who found 85 to 90% compliance on 1 or 2 inspections, that first inspection and a re-inspection. In terms of registration only, we've worked as an interdepartmental team with IT and finance, and we looked into developing a system that could achieve the initiation of registration and registration only by the July 1st date. It appears that as of Friday, we were able to, members of the team, finance director and IT staff, were able to speak with the state, and it looks like we can piggyback on the state system. So it would cut short a great deal of expense and time and allow for a fairly easy measure for this to be implemented. That's what other jurisdictions have done. They saw the advantage of it. It's likely that this would be a bridge approach, largely because there's some cost of using that system that's passed on to the rental property owner. And we believe we could probably reduce that cost doing it in-house. However, our system, which would be incorporated with our future permitting system, won't be in line for that first year. May not be effective for the second, but it allows us to get started, get the information. There will be some cost of transferring it over to our system, but it appears that might be a manageable expense in the future. Additionally, we believe it might be looking at the scale of the costs for registration and dealing with registration alone. Likely that we would do per property registration as opposed to per unit. And the reason is the difference between per unit and per property, because the costs are relatively low, is so slight, and for a limited period of time it would allow us to get accurate information. Wouldn't have an undue burden on someone who has 2 or 3 units compared to someone who has 10. They're very close on that. The range we're looking at right now for that registration, that would be an annual registration, per property would be $25 to $40 per property. That seems to be the range. The issue why we don't have a firm number is we're still refining the HDL software costs that would incorporate us being able to modify the state program to get the information we need and use it. And secondly, I've been informed that we might be able to negotiate less pass-through dollars from the state, which again would provide a savings and reduce the cost up front. In terms of inspection, it is still a work in progress. We had an initial meeting on Friday with the vendor. As you recall, they were here for 3 days kicking off the launch of the permitting process, the development of that permitting process, slated for earliest adoption in October of 15. Fairly substantial program and much needed as our current permitting system is not supported. If it went down, we'd be reduced to index cards, I think. That being said, we have discussed with them the most appropriate means and are extracting the costs to incorporate it. The good news is, given time, we can make it part of the process from the beginning rather than an after-the-fact retrofit. And it is now a design consideration as we move forward. How will inspections be handled? How will they be processed? And what will the expense be? I don't have full information on that. Our very preliminary numbers on that, can be anywhere from $70 to $110 a unit once every 3 years. Again, there's a notion of whether there, as you know from the ordinance, there's the provision to have reduced costs in terms of multiple units being sampled, and we will know more as we develop estimates with the vendor. Can't give you more finite data than that at this point. So that's sort of where we are now. What staff would propose if council did choose to take action on the ordinance before you, with the modifications as suggested, we could begin registration July 1st. We would have completed registration by the end of that month of 2015, and we would move forward to implement. Could not do it any sooner than after October of 15, but we would follow whenever the permit system came on, since we would design it in as part of that program. I know that Peter and I would be happy to answer any questions you might have on the draft ordinance or on the implementation.
Okay, we've got Jean and then Michael.
Thank you for that presentation, Rick. When you say the range from 25 to 40, how do you get to 25, or how does that work?
If the full state cost is passed on, it's $19 was our first estimate. However, as I understand it, we may be able to work with them to reduce that cost, since we're already seeking some records. Okay. And we just don't know.
You don't know
that's
the range, okay.
If it was 40, 20 would be the expense associated with our system, and 20 is just a pass-through for the state. If we could reduce that number, we save the cost for the property owner.
Thank you.
Michael?
I'm really looking forward to getting this out the door and implemented next year. But you raised a few questions, and maybe we need to go backward a bit. We were talking about a per unit charge, and you're saying that you'd rather do a per property charge. But if it is a per property charge, then the fee, it seems to need to be scaled based on how many units are on a piece of property. So you register the property with a single piece of paper, but you pay a higher fee if there's 100 units versus 10 units on that piece of property. Is that correct? There would be a scaling of the fees if you did it by property?
For the inspections, what I would say is we're going to, should you choose to take action on this, we would come back to you with a fee schedule and discuss that. Our thought was we can certainly charge per unit, and we have a rough estimate of that cost. It's about $8 per unit. Plus the registration pass-through. It seems, looking at the system itself, $8 or $9. It seems, looking at the system itself, we should just do a per property to make it simple to start for registration only. But the inspections have always been intended to be based on a per unit basis.
Okay, so the inspections would be based on actual number of units
Yes.
inspected. Fine.
Yes.
But for registration, it seems to me slightly unfair for someone, maybe someone had 100 units and they register for a charge, and someone had only, a duplex to register, and it'd be the same registration fee. Shouldn't the fee scale as a matter of equity? And that's why I think we were looking at the per unit registration charges, so that the fee scaled and created some kind of fairness.
The work to register them would be the same. The way the system is coming out, and the difference, it would be slight in terms of actual cost. We do think, again, we'll come back to you with a suggested fee schedule and rationale for it, but I'd like to get that number more refined so we see what we're actually talking about, because if you're dealing with a difference of $5 and they're the same work for us to record both, it seems having a standard fee might be
So the
useful.
registration fee doesn't just support the short-term work of actually registering the property, but it supports the program entirely. So you have to kind of buy into the program, and that, it seems to me, would scale with a larger number of units.
Correct. The way we've structured this is the upfront costs for registration by itself, because those are more known, and the operating costs for registration by itself are separated out onto that fee. We have not included the fee for the rental inspections, and the reason is it's not as precise. We are still trying to get our arms around that amount for the software implementation and conversion. So it seemed to meet the deadline of getting us up and running for accepting registrations by the 1st. Look at what the cost would be for that. Let's do a 1 year, suggest to you to do a 1 year unique first year to get this up and running, and we could see what we actually come in with and refine it based on what we see.
I guess that I understand why they're asking for the fee to be pulled out and established by resolution and not in the ordinance. But I would, we need maybe at some later date need to provide direction on what that fee structure looks like when it comes back, because I would be looking for that fairness element. I don't need to build it into the ordinance, but in the end, I don't want an unfair structure to come forward.
Okay. Madam Mayor, and then Pinky.
No, you go ahead. No, you go ahead.
Well, I think it might be good to have a discussion when we bring those forward about the difference between how we do taxes and fees, because really the fee that an individual pays is supposed to be directly proportionate to the work that it takes to do. And the taxes that we pay are for everybody to pay for things that benefit all of us. So I think it is important. I think sometimes fees get out of control because we use fees to subsidize things that taxes should pay for.
But this wouldn't be that case. Program support is a fee-based
And I think
service.
Rick says that we can come forward with that when we know how we're supporting the program. Right now, though, to register, whether you have 1 million units or 1 unit or 2, like I do, is only cost that. And if we're going to say it's a fee, then I think the fee needs to be commensurate with the work it takes to process it. And then we'll bring back the recommendation for the rest.
But again, processing isn't the only program cost.
Well, and that's why we'll bring back to you a proposal on covering the cost of the program, because that was one of the goals that we have, is covering the cost.
Okay, Pinky?
Different subject. Maybe, Peter and Rick, you could give me a little bit more clarification on the complaint process, because I might not understand the legalities here. Part of my rationalization around against mandatory for everybody is the majority of people are in compliance. And I really wanted us to address the problem issues. And the way, if I'm understanding this correctly, it kind of makes it hard for tenants to ask for action on places that deserve a complaint and deserve to have action and deserve to be put on the top of the priority list. So would you explain to me, am I understanding this correctly, that does take away some of the power from the tenants in regards to them being put at the top and their places get inspected in a priority?
So this does not really affect the current code enforcement process that we already have. But there's an attempt in here to acknowledge a couple things and to tie it and to allow something that has gone through the complaint process to require that property to then be put on the inspection list for the following year. So you could go through the code enforcement process. A tenant could ask the city to follow up. An inspector could go out independently of this, find a problem with the code, go through a corrective process, even a citation. This just acknowledges that, for example, if you go through that and there is a citation that's upheld, not only would you have achieved compliance at that point, but that property then, in addition to that, would be put on the list for the following year. So it's really an additive thing, it's not diminishing in any way the current code process.
Anyone else? Who's next? Jack.
I guess first of all, I wanted to support what Michael was saying about the per property per unit issue. I think that there are a lot of different costs associated that really should be applied on a per unit basis. If it's a situation where the state wants to go and charge a certain amount per transaction, yeah, I can understand the per property aspect of it, but all of the other facets of the program, I think, really are on a per unit basis, whether they're administrative costs for a data entry person, or it's the educational costs associated with conducting classes or producing material or having a website. All that should be on a per unit basis, and I really, except for the $19 or the $10 or whatever it might cost for the state to go and charge us for a transaction fee, The rest of it, I think, should be on a per unit basis, and I think it would be that's, you know, if we're talking about fairness and application of the program, that would be the best. I'm trying to wrap my head around the administrative issues associated with what you were talking about, the 5-year inspection incentive. And I see a couple things. First of all, are there options that you thought of that would equate to? I mean, you're talking about a reduction in fees, but what fees and how, you know, how would that affect the rest of the program if we're also looking at a need to have enough revenue in order to support the overall program? And would other people get penalized because we're giving discounts to some others?
If I might respond, a couple of things, and first back to the fees. The only reason we started with per property because it may be easiest, but it wasn't exclusive, and clearly want to separate registration from inspection, which would need to be per unit. And it'll come forward when we have more information, and I'll give the analysis on both ways, and you can address those as a council. Then second, on to the issue of the 5-year extension. There are two ways of balancing it. One way is to extend from 3. It's a staffing issue where we staff up for or contract out, and we're not certain if we could do either. From conversations with other folks who've implemented similar programs, they're having a difficult time finding private sector folks to do inspections, so the jurisdiction tends to do a great deal of them. And we don't have capacity in our current staff to swell up for a bulk of extra inspections and then shrink down. So you want to minimize the change. Finances are one way, where you can offer a renewal at less amount, especially as we get our arms around the cost for registration for complying quickly. The second is we could extend the term from 3 years to inspect all to 5. That evens it out a little bit more in terms of the workload and allows us to be able to staff appropriately. We might have less than an FTE. We might have a half FTE, but a whole position to do it. Those are all things we're trying to work through. The locking into a 3-year full 100% inspection and a 5-year bonus was the problem. If you wish to direct us to come back with the fee schedule that says here's the term bonus or a dollar bonus, we could do an analysis on both. That's certainly one way of proceeding. It just right now it's hard to get our arms around the relative costs with some unknowns.
Well, if outside of the fee issue, you know, shifting it from 3 to 5 years doesn't seem to solve the problem, because it would be like, okay, now we're going to create a program where the initial inspection is 5 years, but we'll have a 7-year incentive for people that pass the first one. That it doesn't, you know, it has either got to be financial or it's got to be something else. But then I'm trying to figure out how does that work with financial, because if we're giving a discount, who's going to pay for that discount? Because, you know, if we're trying to create a program that's a balanced enterprise fund and we're giving away money on one end, it's got to come from somewhere else.
And a lot would be, if we have folks who comply, the assumption is that they're going to comply on first inspection, and it's going to be basically a checking of what they've already complied with. In essence, it's a freshening of the prior inspection. So it should take us less time, in a sense, so one could pass on that savings as the incentive. We could structure the fee that way, perhaps, if you've passed, and you comply the second time, it's less for your inspection. Something like that. We don't have the inspection component ready at this point. We have registration, you know, at least as a process for that, but the inspection's still a work in progress, and that might be where you can offer the incentive, because it should be less the second time they go through.
There's 2 provisions in here for giving the director to develop an incentive program, and the first one has to do with the registration fee itself. And this is on page 182, part B. In the registration part, that seems to be not workable. And that, I mean, I can understand wanting to give an incentive for the inspections, but I don't think we should be giving incentives for registration. You either register or you don't. And if you don't, then there's going to be consequences. But if you do, it's just simply the black and white registration fee. So is that language in there supposed to be for something different?
I think the intent was to provide, it was inspection that you were offering, you suggested the incentive on, so that if you passed, you had 5 years, you didn't have to be re-inspected. And I think the intent here was to provide for incentive, not for registration.
But it's in the, do you understand that it's in the registration section?
Right.
And there really is a difference between a registration fee and an inspection
Yes, we could
fee.
certainly revise that.
Okay.
Okay, Terry and then Roxanne?
Yeah. I fully understand, how, since we put in so much time, we want to be sure on issues that they're going to work in terms of like the fees are going to cover everything. But at the same time, I also realize that once we pass this and put it in the policy in place, it behooves the administration to make it work. Because if incentives or fee structures that they come up with aren't penciling out, it's going to come back to us to have to, to make those changes, because they're going to be hitting on us that, well, we don't want to pull from the general fund to do this. So it's going to behoove those, the administration to come up with policies that are going to work. And if they're not, it's going to be like our parking fees downtown. It's going to come up to us again to make those hard decisions. So I think initially getting this off the ground, up and running, getting this in place is the big thing. Let's maybe then step back, let the administration, the directors do their work with the fine points of it and bring it back to us, because the pressure to make the budget work on this, we know we know Kelly isn't going to want to dip into the general fund on this. And so, so let's, maybe we can step back with that part of it and get this basic part out, done with, and bring back something that's going to work.
Roxanne and then Jean. Thank you,
Yeah,
Terry.
I'm really uncomfortable with going forward with the ordinance as it is now, because we just have so many unanswered questions, especially as it relates to what the program costs are going to be. And the value that we all agreed upon was we wanted this to be a cost-effective program for all parties. I have no assurance of that at this point. So that's why I would love for us to take this as provisions as we're going forward, as we get more information, we figure more of this out. I'm not ready to vote on this.
Jean and then Michael.
I understand your frustration, but I also understand that what we're doing here today is moving something forward, and I don't think it's critical, and Peter, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we passed first and second now. Third and final can come whenever. I mean, we don't have to vote on it early next month. The point I'm trying to make is so Rick and everybody involved in this has enough time to put together the package and the numbers that Councilwoman Murphy's talking about. And I'm looking for that too, but I understand, we've come such a long way on this. Boy, I tell you, we've spent a lot of time on this, and we're not going to know anything until we keep moving forward. So is that correct?
So yeah, there are times, for example, last week we had a vacation ordinance that was held back for some specific action by a third party. There's no reason that the council, but you'd want that to be specific direction at the time that you're voting on first and second, that it be held off for a certain period of time. And if that's the case, it's not a problem.
I just want us to have every piece of information we need before we take that third and final vote, because once we take the third and final vote, that's it.
Michael and then Jack.
So I have a small question, but just related to this. The fees were pulled out of put into an ordinance. I would actually like to see several other things that were pulled out administratively and have them come before the council for approval by a resolution, not by the ordinance. And this would give the council one last weigh-in That this is really what the details are. This is really what the checklist is. So it doesn't need to be done by ordinance. It can be done at a later date, but I still think it needs to come before us and says, yeah, this is really what we want. It's not bigger than we intended, not more invasive than we intended. So that's a procedural way we can prevent the program from being implemented without first looking at it. So like the fees, they come back to us, and that'll be a nice check. I wanted to talk about something small, though, and going back 1-2 years, we talked about providing exemptions for what wouldn't be included in the program. I'm looking on page 181 for the exemptions, section A. And one of those exemptions is someone, had a job shift and they were out of, town for 6 months or a year and they rented their house out temporarily. And so one of the exemptions that the Rental Housing Association brought up is, like Seattle has, why not exempt houses that are rented for a year or less, that were owner-occupied both before and after. If there's interest, I'd like to maybe add that exemption too. If there's not, we don't need to add it to the exemptions. But I think it's a reasonable exemption. Seattle already has some language that was in a letter. I don't know if staff has seen that. Again, this is for someone who was in an owner-occupied home both before and after a period of 1 year or less.
Kelly, did you want to speak to that item?
Yeah, one of the things I think is important, Terry's addressed it, Jean's addressed it, is there's a goal that you have for this policy, and then there's administrative rules that you put together to include some of the particulars, the little things that Michael was just talking about that don't need to be in the ordinance, because once you start listing things in an ordinance, then you keep having to add to the list instead of saying that there's these kinds of exemptions and we keep track of those through an administrative rule or administrative code. So the main thing that we need to know, and I agree with 100%, is there should be exemptions so that people aren't getting unnecessary inspections. And we're happy to talk about those. I would say that the more specifics you put in the ordinance that don't have to do with how you will measure if the administration's doing a good job, not measuring the specifics, but measuring the outcomes, the harder it's going to be to implement and to change.
The exemptions are in the ordinance, so they already are enumerated, and so you can't do it later by administrative action if it's not in there now. So.
Well, or you could take those out and have them done administratively.
I think that's going backwards. One of the things we've been fighting is the uncertainty. If we pull out all the details, like even who's in the program or not, we've created uncertainty. I'm trying to create certainty rather than more uncertainty. I would like to put in that exemption.
Okay, and I would just say that before we just put in that exemption, which may be acceptable to everybody, that we should think about other exemptions that you might have heard about from others that would need to be put in at the same time, because the list can get pretty long.
Okay. Rick?
If I could just,
Peter?
I just wanted to hear clarification of what your proposed exemption was. Could you restate, please? Just so I can get it down.
Yeah, the Rental Housing Association suggested language based on the Seattle code, and that reads in the Seattle code, housing units rented for not more than 12 consecutive months as a result of property owner who previously occupied the unit as a primary residence, taking and this doesn't need to be in there, work-related leave of absence or assignment such as an academic sabbatical or temporary transfer. I think the point is it has to be in the primary residence of the person and for a year or less. That would be the nature of the exemption.
Is there a limit on the size of the unit? If I'm a condominium owner and I had 30 units?
I don't see it in this language here.
Okay,
I
so
haven't looked at the Seattle
let me
ordinance.
research that then. Okay.
Do you have a copy of the Rental Housing Association's letter?
Yes, I'll review that.
So essentially, Michael, somebody who rents their house out for less than a year when they go somewhere else.
Right.
Okay.
Got it.
That's a little less specific. Anything, Jean?
I would like to move the ordinance that's in the packet with direction to staff that it come back when everybody has enough time to bring it forward. Do we have to set a date, or do we not?
No, you don't.
All right. Then I just make a motion that we vote first and second tonight, and the staff will bring it back when it's fully completed and all questions are answered.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Peter?
Well, in listening to Rick, I just wanted to point out that there's one provision that, based on what he's stated in terms of implementation, should be changed, and that's that July 1st date. I realize we could change that third and final, but my understanding is that if that was August 1st, so if the word July was changed to August, that I believe that would take care of that. I just want to make sure that we get as much.
Respectfully, you can suggest we initiate registration on July 1st to be completed by August 1st.
Would you
Yeah, I'll put that in the motion, that's fine.
amend it?
Amend it.
Okay, the motion's been amended to August 1st and agreed upon by Terry, who seconded. Okay, Jack?
And does that also include the elimination of the language on page 182B that had to do with the registration fee incentives? Because we've already covered it under the other language associated with inspection incentives.
If council agrees, that would clarify it. It appears to be
Okay,
inconsistent.
I'll include that also.
Okay, can you clarify for the record?
Yes, it's on page 182, section B. This is a 6.15.040B. The first paragraph, there's added language, and that added language would be deleted. It says the director is authorized to develop an incentive and the fee structure to benefit those rental properties that pass initial inspection, leading to a certificate of inspection.
Okay, seeing no objections, that is as amended.
Okay. And then I had a couple other questions. For the display of registration and not having it on the back of the front door, the way the language is currently stated, as long as it's on the inside, including the back side of a water heater that is in the basement, technically it passes. Can we say something like prominently displayed?
Visibly.
Sure.
I mean,
Visibly.
It's reasonable.
whatever language, but just something that.
Prominent.
And then the
Above
second.
the fireplace. Sorry.
The second thing is there is a lot of this that has been taken out of this underlying ordinance that was fairly prescriptive in what it was stating and is now going to be put under the director's purview. My concern, and this, Rick, I'm glad that you're with us, and I hope that you really enjoy our community, and I hope we really enjoy your work. But the thing is that we've had 4 planning directors in the last 8 years. I have no idea how this program is going to get implemented in the future, and I hope that you will be implementing it for a really long time. But who knows? I'm a little concerned about the fact that the council was providing specific directions over the course of the development of this ordinance this year, and it's getting removed, those specific details. And I understand you don't want to have a whole bunch of details, but in answer to your question, Kelly, or your comment, is that you put the details in there, and then you also say, and whatever the director, also feels is important. But at least you have that minimum level of policy instruction, even though there are somewhat detailed oriented.
And I guess I'm just saying that I think there's a reasonable debate to be had about where those should exist. I don't think we're just saying, Rick, make it up every day as you go along. Correct? Well, I mean, he'd like that, but I don't think that's what he's saying. But we do memorialize it. It's not up in the air, just...
Typically, we promulgate administrative rules that explain it in detail, and they'll certainly be available to the council. So council understands why we took the specificity. It was a lot to see what we could fit onto the screens to get registered in the timeline we had. That's where that came. We didn't know how many lines we could add, and we wanted to have the latitude to be able to certainly get the basics, the address, the number of units, those kind of things, but we wanted to do it most cost effectively. So that was a limitation. To answer your point, I really do not welcome a great degree of discretion. I'd rather have it prescriptive. I will prepare administrative rules. They will be subject, for your information. They'll include all the information, quite frankly, that you asked for, though its timing and where it's administered and how it's administered may be different depending on what we find out. That's the sole distinction.
Okay. I mean, I make the point just because, I mean, we have administrative policies that I think the council, at least I would like to go and revisit. For instance, traffic calming on collector arterials. It's an administrative policy. Council could take it up as an issue and you know, create something else, but it's created some problems in the past. And I don't want to get into that same situation under a program like this, where we're having to kind of go back and forth. So I appreciate your willingness to commit to the intent of what we've previously passed.
Absolutely.
Roxanne and then Michael, and maybe we can get to a vote.
What's going to happen in the instance where you've had a look at it and you determine that properties inspected once every 3 years is not going to make the best sense for the whole program? Would we just have to get a council majority vote to set it to whatever year makes the most sense?
As it stands now, we have a report back to this body the first 2 years to talk about the issues we do and uncover. And it is anticipated there will be refinement in the program. There always is. As you do something, you find ways to be more efficient and to achieve the end. So I think that's going to be the feedback mechanism on it.
Yeah, Roxanne.
Just for the record, I'd just like to say I think this is a big mistake that we're making because I think we need more years to assess and improve the program, but I'm willing to support it just to see how it goes and constantly refine.
Michael.
Two things. One, going to the issue with regard to making administrative rules to fill in the details and a lot of the program particulars. It sounds like what you're saying, Rick, is those administrative rules will really not be for city council approval as you're seeing it right now. And personally, I think that's a mistake. I would like fees and also some particulars to come back to council for review. Do you think that those administrative rules will need council approval?
Fees.
Okay. Because, well, fees do, but there's other policies and administrative things where I've been told very clearly in my time on the council, that's an administrative rule, the council's job is done. And again, I'm afraid of uncertainties being created. So is it coming back for us for approval? If so, I'm totally good.
The purview of council in terms of is to set policy and set fees. Staff is charged with crafting process if it's not specifically defined. You've provided very clear intent on you wish to accomplish. We've tried to respond accordingly with our approach. I think in this case, the instances that are unresolved deal mostly with fees and their application and timeline. But I think we can resolve that. And clearly, I will inform the council on the best process to implement the policy intent. If we have not achieved that, council's right is always to bring it up as an item and direct staff through the mayor's office to revise it.
Well, let me put it another way. If by pulling out all the particulars and then giving it to you, do you still understand that the particulars that were drawn out constitute sort of direction from policy direction from staff, an example? Because if you follow the examples, then again, I'm good. But if you don't feel guided by the text that's taken out, then I think we provided no policy direction. So have we provided policy direction by the struct text? Is that being taken as policy direction?
I think the difference is between how you do it and what you want to achieve. And I think the council, every single meeting, has the opportunity to say, I don't believe you're meeting the goal that we set. But I do think it's difficult when you're too prescriptive about exactly how you do it, because as you can see with all the information that Rick brought up today about developing this, it's a lot more complex than what you can put in an ordinance, and sometimes what you put in the ordinance makes it impossible to reach the goal that you want. So any administrative rule is subject to council information, and if we're not meeting the goal, you can say, I want you to revise that administrative rule because you're not meeting our goal. But I'm very clear, based on what you proposed over the last however many years we've worked on this, at least the 3 years I've been here, what the intent is and the direction that you would like us to go. Yes.
This is the second matter, if I may.
Okay.
It has to do with the concern raised in the Rental Housing Association's letter. They wanted language added in there to indicate that the inspections were on a random basis, and they felt that that was left out, and that would create some uncertainty or some problem. I didn't see the word random anywhere in the document. I noticed, I wrote it in two places. On page 185, under certificates of inspection, all rentals shall be inspected every 3 years. Is there any place in here we need to indicate the kind of the randomness of who's selected? Should that be in the ordinance, or
It's the next sentence.
is it random there?
Well,
I
no,
believe
it
it's
just says
stated.
The department shall.
Periodically select.
Yeah.
Does random need to be in there? The Rental Housing Association thought that that was an important issue, and I wasn't sure how much of that mattered, that there was no certainty on that.
So right now, the ordinance states that it will be based on a methodology, a selection based on a methodology adopted by the director to best carry out the intent of the chapter. And the important thing will be for this program to be cost-effective and as well as adhere to due process. I'm certain that it will be done on the basis of a methodology. In other words, there has to be a fairness and due process element to it. Random may not be the best method.
Well, this goes back to an old discussion where that if we did targeted or regional inspections, it actually raised some legal risk on the city's part with selective enforcement. And random was actually seen as the way to immunize the city from any appearance that we were targeting particular populations or particular regions. So there's a reason why randomness was part of an important discussion going back a year or two with regard to how we would implement these things.
Well, we're not talking about doing it by region, but I think the other thing in the principles that the council passed was that we focus on problems. So part of our selection criteria could be people that have had problems in the past, but not by area.
I think that raises problems with selective enforcement.
Well, Peter? It's a timing priority issue, Michael. We're going to do everybody.
How about Peter and then Terry?
There's examples out there where they base it on the age of the building. So there are reasonable, appropriately legal ways to do this in a way that is fair and meets a rational basis test. We'll be working to make sure that it's legally compliant. The main policy direction in here is that it's a methodology developed by the director to best carry out the intent of the program.
And if I might, since the director's here, I'll opine that the policy, I hear the policy intent of council, the intent is to be random. However, we can put in a metric for frequent complaints that have been verified that can add it back in, or a history of complaints or concerns that are raised that are verified. And I think that's the tempers just the random. If you said random alone, we couldn't add that. We want to make sure we have it. I also would just take a moment, if I could. It's not good practice for us to come and sort of create rules on the fly in terms of process. And I appreciate council considering taking first and second reading, but holding till we perfect the details, because that's where the rubber really hits the road. In most instances before this body, it will be our practice to bring you draft programs. However, we understand that this is one where very strong policy intent, desire to express that, and we will follow up responsibly with a program that will implement it fully.
Thanks, Rick. Terry, and then Jack, and then I'm going to call a question.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, just to move the process along, since we have a motion and second before us on this, if there are specific changes that somebody wants, I would ask that a motion be made regarding that to see if there are 4 votes for the amendment of it, rather than just having, the individual discussion, because first let's make a motion to see if it's going to be part of that, just so we can move this along right now.
Thanks, Terry. Jack?
So my understanding is that the fee schedule will be presented prior to the third and final vote. Will the administrative rules be done that way too? Or is that going to come after the third and final?
We will certainly have an outline of our process, enough to provide a fairly good picture of how it'll be implemented. Some things may still be in play. I'm thinking specifically about the license, the inspection, but we'll say the overarching way we're approaching it will be described.
And what is your internal deadline for the fee structure and for us to do the third and final vote?
Right now, again, this is as fresh as late on Friday. Speaking with the state, there are further discussions there. Discussions with our vendor for the permit system just initiated on Friday. I could probably give you a better estimate at the very first meeting of January. Let's see how those discussions progress, because that's what's informing the process.
But you're looking within 30 to 60 days versus
This is
May
not,
1st.
the intent is to return to you as soon as we possibly can. I'll update you in early January on that date.
Okay.
And
Thank
my
you.
hope is we do it. And to be fair, we are entering the holidays. It might be difficult to get information progressed. So we'll just keep you updated and move it along.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to call the question unless there is anything else anyone wants to say. See nothing. All those in favor of the ordinance in the packet as amended by council, with the understanding that this is first and second, third and final will be delayed until we have full program information, including fiscal information from staff. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes 7-0. Thank you
Thank you,
very
staff,
much.
for all the
Thanks,
hard work.
Rick.
Is there any old and new business?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to wait 1 minute. In case anyone wants to clear out of here, we'll give you a second to do that before we move on. And if you want to
you mind
carry
if-
on conversations, maybe you could do so out in the lobby? Okay. Any old or new business, Terry?
Yeah, I've got a couple items. First off, I want to mention the Martin Luther King celebration is returning to City Hall Monday, January 19th at noon. We will be having a Martin Luther King celebration in City Hall here. The Culshan Choir is going to be back and performing, and if you haven't heard the Culshan Choir in City Hall, it is amazing. Our own Roxanne Murphy will be the MC this year, and speakers are going to be going to include Mayor Kelly Linville, Edward Skip Williams, Kristen French, and the poet Ellen Murphy. So just want to get the word out that, yes, we will be having an MLK celebration again this year in City Hall. And so come on out. It's always a moving event. The other announcement is, this is so I don't forget it tonight. Tonight, under old and new business, we will be drawing the order in which candidates that are applying for the city council position will be speaking. And so I thought if we draw them tonight, people will know, what order it's going to go. And so we will be doing that process tonight. And the other announcement is Wednesday, 7 o'clock here in City Hall, we will be going through the process of hearing from candidates for the city council and, in all probability, appointing a new city council person. There's never certainty. Yes, that's it for me.
Thanks, Terry. Anyone else, old or new business? Kelly?
And if you'd like to have some very nice hors d'oeuvres at the Light Catcher prior to the meeting on the 17th, MNAC, I'm hosting MNAC at the Light Catcher, and you're welcome to come, and it's at, I'm asking Brian, I think it's at 5 o'clock, but I'll let you know for sure.
Great, thank
And
you,
you're all
Kelly.
welcome to come.
So MNAC, Mayor's Neighborhood Advisory Committee, Council, Committee, Commission? Anyone else, old or new business? I have old business or new business, whatever.
Almost old business.
Just get as many in while you can, I know. Oh. So, yeah, I will be resigning my position this evening, assuming we pass a budget. After that, and then handing the gavel to Terry, who is Council President Pro Tem, and he will carry out the officer or the role of President until the end of the year. And yeah, that's all I'm going to say on that right now. Okay. Seeing no other old or new business, we have one set of minutes to approve. Oh, yeah, Kelly?
5:30.
Thank you. For the Mayor's Neighborhood Advisory Commission at the Lightcatcher Museum, Wednesday. Okay. We have one set of... Right. I won't even go there.
No.
Okay, committee meeting minutes for December 8th.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes pass 7-0. We are adjourned.